the session on career strategies and building aptitudes with Habiba Islam. Habiba is going to start by giving a talk, and then we will have 30 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions during the talk, submit them on the Swap Card app and upvote your favorites. And I'd now like to introduce our speaker, my colleague Habiba. Habiba is a member of the one-on-one team at 80,000 Hours, where she does career advising calls. She previously served as the Senior Administrator for the Future of Humanity Institute and the Global Priorities Institute at Oxford. Before that, she qualified as a barrister and worked in management consulting, specializing in operations for public and third sector clients. Please join me in welcoming Habiba.
Thanks, Arden. Okay, so today I want to talk about career strategies. Because you're here at Effective Altruism Global, you want to use your career to do a bunch of good. But it's not always straightforward working out what that specifically means for your career choices. After all, careers are multi-decade-long things, and you're probably going to have the most impact later on down the line. So your task is to work out how to get from A to B, where A is where you are right now, and B is something like ending factory farming or averting a catastrophic pandemic. So those are fantastic, ambitious goals. And when you try and sort of think about how your career should work in relation to that, it's not obvious what you should be aiming to get to and what you should be doing right now to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. So I want to talk a bit about career strategy. That's why I want to focus on that for this talk. And what I would like to sort of do is, first of all, set out one kind of framework that you could use for this, focusing on a sort of simplified version of just focusing on causes. And then I'm going to use that to contrast with the aptitude framework that you may have come across from a post by Holden Karnofsky from Open Philanthropy earlier this year. And then I'm going to share some of my personal thoughts on the aptitude framework. I should flag that this is very much not official 80K opinion. This is Habiba's own thoughts on this. So on the official temperature scale of takes from cold to hot, I would say that this talk it's kind of lukewarm. So this is a thing that I've thought about a bunch over the last few months. It's very relevant to my job doing careers advising, but it's quite a hard area, I think, to have a lot of evidence-based thoughts on. I'm pretty interested to hear a lot of different people's views on this. So yeah, very much personal thoughts. Okay, so if you're thinking about career strategy, how do I get from A to B? One thing that you could do is sort of have a cause-focused framework here. And I should flag that the thing I'm going to set out here is a kind of simplified version of what that might look like. I don't think anyone proposes something exactly like this, but it's worth saying that sort of some of 80,000 Hours advice maybe has like a bit of this flavor. So here's the kind of like slightly caricatured, simplified version of what a cause-focused framework of thinking about careers would look like. So what's the motivating idea? Well, you might think that your impact across the course of your career is determined by these three factors multiplied together. We've got the pressingness of the problem, the effectiveness of the opportunity, and then your personal fit for the specific role. And when you're thinking about each of these three things, maybe you think that the pressingness of the problem is the biggest deal, right? So if you hold everything else constant, you're going to get the biggest gains and impact by switching to a more effective cause area or working on a more pressing problem than you would by, for example, switching to a role with like slightly better fit. And so if that's the way that you're thinking about impact, then you might want to zone in on this pressingness of the problem as the kind of the key part of your career planning. So then what might that look like in terms of what you do for your career strategy? Well, okay, you could start off with thinking about cause areas then. You sort of do some thinking, do some exploration, work out what do I think are the top cause areas to work on, and then maybe think backwards from that to the kinds of roles or paths that might be working on particular bottlenecks in that cause area. And then you've got sort of some short list of kind of options. So like, say your thought is something like factory farming is the thing. Roles that might work on this could be something like, maybe there's like lawyers who can bring litigation to try and make progress on animal rights. Or maybe there's like nonprofits that are doing advocacy here. So you've got some sort of like short list of roles. And then how might you pick between these different roles? Well, kind of a combination of different factors, but ultimately probably what you're after is like pick one of these roles based on which seems like it's going to be like the biggest expected impact for me to like go down. And then if you've got your kind of goal in mind, say you're like, okay, I'm going to try and become a lawyer, work on this like animal rights litigation stuff. What should I be doing between now and then when I'm doing a bunch of different, when I'm having a bunch of impact? Well, perhaps the thing that you should be doing is like aim for that role, do all the things that are going to get you there as fast as possible, go for law school, do a bunch of internships, that kind of thing. And if it doesn't work out, you don't get into the law school that you wanted, maybe you go back to step 2 and you like look at that list again and see what's the next best role that might be a really good fit that's like still aiming for this like ending factory farming kind of cause. Okay, so that would be a kind of cause-focused way of thinking about like career planning, focusing on cause and then role, picking on impact and like aiming for that specific role. But that is not the only thing that you could do. And some of you may have seen this post on the Effective Altruism Forum earlier this year from Holden Karnofsky, the CEO of Open Philanthropy, setting out an alternate framework for thinking about career choice, which is kind of in contrast to this kind of like cause-focused thing. So I think the motivating thought that, that Holden may have had is probably something like, hang on, I'm not really sure that that's how people have actually like got to impactful roles. Like if I look around me and see like who's doing really amazing stuff, who's having like a ton of impact, what do they actually do to get to where they are? Well, they really actually just went and got really amazing at something that they were great at. And then it like opened up a bunch of opportunities and they managed to get into like really impactful roles where now they're like a grant maker at Open Phil, or they're like on the board of like OpenAI or something like that. And so maybe actually this kind of cause-focused framework isn't like super useful in terms of getting to impact. So he wrote a bit about this in this post, and also there's a podcast with Rob Whiblin, one of the 80,000 Hours podcast, where he talks about this a bit more. And so instead he proposes this kind of aptitude framework, thinking about picking, building a particular aptitude, getting really good at it, especially if you're early career. So let's just like dive into what does that actually look like. So he doesn't define in the post what an aptitude is. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to use a definition that is something like, an aptitude is like a cluster of behaviors or skills that you might have, maybe even some like natural dispositions that makes you particularly good at doing a specific thing. And some examples of aptitudes might be like helping organizations achieve their objectives, or maybe evaluating claims against each other. So those are the kinds of things that you could be aiming to get really good at. And in Holden's post, he sets out 9 different aptitudes that he thinks are particularly useful for people who have a long-termist worldview to consider. So then, how do you pick between these different potential aptitudes that you could try and get good at? Well, Holden particularly encourages people to use these couple of rules of thumb. So one of them is like, do what you'll succeed at. Like, pick the thing that you could be like really amazing at. And the other one is, take your intuitions and your feelings seriously. If you have some like misgivings about something, or there's like another one that you just like really feel actually like gut motivated, that you just have so many great ideas for this particular area, like pay attention to that and like use that to inform some of your decision making. And then the thing that you should do is like go get really good at this aptitude once you've picked one. Okay, so the aptitude framework looks like, aptitude is the thing to focus on, not cause area, not a specific role. Pick an aptitude and pick between them based on this thing that you might call like personal fit. And maybe that's some combination of like proficiency in this particular aptitude, plus also this kind of like maybe some like gut level excitement about or motivation to do really well at it. And then the thing that you should do is this kind of career strategy is go get great at that aptitude. Like that's your goal. Do as well as you possibly can at like building that kind of aptitude, and then later on down the line you're gonna try and like apply it to have as much impact as possible. So what I want to do is go through each of these 3 pieces of the aptitude framework and share some thoughts on sort of what I think about it, how strong this seems to be as like a career strategy. Are you with me so far? Okay, we got nods in the room. Cool, so first piece, what to focus on. Should it be aptitude as the thing to focus on? Should we be taking more of this kind of like cause or role focused thing? Well, so I am very sympathetic to a lot of the reasons that I think Holden is a lot of the places that Holden is coming from when he's thinking about this. So especially if you happen to be a long-termist, it is really hard to make predictions about what specific roles in like 40 years' time are going to be really crucial for actually like reducing existential risk or something. Like we don't really have that great an idea right now about like what those specific roles might be. We've got some good guesses, but I think there's some use in being like somewhat humble about that, and potentially like trying to do the thing that sets you up to be in like the best position across a bunch of different like possible futures or something. And then there's this piece around, well, if you look into the past about, look at the people who've had the most impact that you admire the most, how did they get to the position that they got to where they were having a bunch of impact? I mean, chances are they didn't really come from an EA type mindset where they like thought about a problem in a specific bottleneck and then like really aimed for that particular role or path. This is like not a really common thing that people have done, and so we just don't really have very much evidence about whether this is actually going to be a really useful way of like getting people to really impactful roles, or whether maybe it's just better that people sort of do the thing that has worked in the past, which is like people have just got really good at like a particular skill, and it's opened a bunch of doors, and then they've managed to have a bunch of impact. So I'm pretty sympathetic to a couple of those different reasons for thinking about aptitudes instead. But I have some reservations that I don't think this takes us all the way from focusing away from like cause area roles onto aptitudes in general. So one thing is that I just do think sometimes aiming at paths is useful. So there are some specific guesses that we can make about what might be useful in the future. And I think as a community, it's really useful for like some people to make bets on those particular paths, and other people can be sort of hedging a bit more and going for generally useful aptitudes. But it is really useful for like some people to start down the path of something that requires a lot of expertise to be built up and requires a lot of subject matter knowledge, like becoming an academic researcher in biosecurity policy, or like aiming for like a particular political position. And I think Holden and I probably don't disagree on this. I think that he thinks that it's really useful to go for academic research or some of these political positions. But what's going on here is that he's got them in the framework, but they're kind of classed as sort of like specific aptitudes. There's like an aptitude for academic research. There's an aptitude for like political and bureaucratic aptitudes. So I kind of think that those are sort of paths in aptitude clothing. Is that a problem? Is this just semantics? Is it actually like if the aptitude framework covers off these paths, is there actually a problem here? Well, I think I would go one step further and say that, you know, if we actually want people to go for some of these specific paths, if you're trying to do that, then I think some of the most useful careers advice for you is going to be more path specific. It's going to be about what are the specific institutions, who are the people that I need to know, what's the well-trodden route for people aiming for this specific path. And I think glossing this in aptitude terms is probably a little bit unhelpful and a bit distracting for some of those specific paths. So that's one thing. I think, you know, aptitude is like one good direction you could go in, but also I think like the paths and making these guesses on longer term roles is actually pretty useful. Another thing is, you know, even if you're aiming to get this sort of get into a generally really useful position for the future, aptitude is one type of career capital, as we call it 8,000 hours. So there are other types of career capital too that I think are not easily contained within the aptitude framework. It's like a little unclear whether it includes like subject matter knowledge, but it probably doesn't include things like building your network or gaining other resources like earning a bunch of money so that it puts you in a better position. And I do think that this other career capital is really valuable, certainly for some specific paths. And you might think that if you focus on aptitude, a bunch of these other useful bits of career capital will come along with them. And so you can just focus on the aptitude and not worry about the other stuff. I think that might take you some of the way, but I think sometimes there's going to be a trade-off between, are you focusing on like networking and getting to know the people who are going to be really useful contacts of the future, or are you going to aim for a job where you're going to build a bunch of skills that are going to be really useful? And sometimes those trade-offs do exist, and I think it's by focusing just on aptitude, I think this is a simplification that sort of misses some of the nuance that could be really relevant for people's career decisions. And then lastly, it's a little unclear to me, I think, how the aptitude framework interacts with cause choice and thinking about your worldview. So as you may have noticed, Holden's post is specifically aimed at people who already have a long-termist worldview. One of the reasons for that, I think, is that it seems particularly hard to make these predictions for if you have a long-termist worldview about what's going to be really useful later down the line. Maybe you're able to make better predictions in sort of with other cause areas. So if the thought is something like, do the worldview thinking first. Once you've got a sense of like roughly what you think are kind of comparable cause areas, then you can switch on to the thinking about the aptitudes that might be useful for that particular cause area, and then off you go. And if that's the case, then I think that seems basically fine to me. But if instead, I think there's like a suggestion that the aptitude framework is particularly useful because even if you change worldview, even if you change your mind on which cause areas are important, the aptitudes are going to stand you in good stead anyway, and you're going to be able to make a sort of switch later on. Now, if that's part of the message that's going on with the aptitude framework, I think I have more hesitation about whether that's actually as good an idea as like general careers advice for people in the effective altruism community. And I think this is because of that formula that we saw before. I think that like the cause choice can really be the biggest determinant of impact. And I think a lot of people, especially the people that I talk to in advising, I think the message that seems really useful for them to hear is like, spend a bit of time thinking about what you think is actually more important. If some things are 100 times more impactful than others, that's a really big deal in your cause choice. And so focusing on aptitude to the detriment of that message, I think could be like encourage people to like pay less attention to cause choice, which would be a shame. Okay, so that's point number one. Should we focus on aptitude? Roughly, I'm not completely sold that it's good enough to switch completely in that direction, but I think there's some merit to this. The second point was this kind of how to pick between your different options. And I think this is not crucial to using an aptitude framework, but it is part of kind of Holden's advice, is like pick based on personal fit, like pay a lot of attention to what you could be really good at and what you can be really excited about. So there are a ton of reasons why you should pay attention to personal fit. The chance of success in your particular career path is super important. So obviously if you do better at your job, you're going to be having more impact. And this is like even more important if you happen to be aiming for a particular field where success is unevenly distributed and the people who are the very best in their field have like a particularly large share of the impact. In that case, fit is super important and you should definitely pay attention to trying to do the thing that you're going to really succeed at. And on top of that, enjoyment is really important. Like I said, your career is this many decades long thing. You want to pick something that you can thrive at, that you can have sustainable motivation for a long period of time, that you're going to want to be doing, getting up every day to go and do. And I think there are cases in the EA community where people have taken roles that they aren't as excited about because it seemed like there was a community demand, and it hasn't worked out very well with people being burned out and unhappy, and that wasn't good for them, and it also wasn't even good from an impact perspective as well. So there are definitely many people, I think, who are probably listening to this talk who could do well to get this message even stronger. Like, paying attention to your personal fit is a really important consideration when you're making choices about longer term paths. But that said, I think this is the piece of the aptitude framework that I have the most concerns about. So in part, I think one of my biggest concerns is that this kind of focus on excitement or interest can lead people away from making the best decision on impact, I think. I come across cases where people are thinking about, should I do the sort of maths research that I've always really been excited about this kind of theoretical math stuff. It seems really fun and interesting. Or I could kind of pivot into doing something a bit more like mathematical modeling, which might help with pandemics or something. And when people are making those kinds of choices, I think those are hard choices. I don't pretend that I know exactly what's the right answer for them to do in their specific case. But I am excited about people paying attention to what seems like it's going to have the most impact in their career, and not just which thing that they have the most kind of gut level excitement for. And I think that this kind of focus on impact is an important cultural value for the EA community at large. I think I would be sad if we moved more towards kind of a message of do things that you can be really successful at, rather than do the thing that you think is going to have the most impact. In large part because I think that that's instrumentally useful for encouraging us to have more impact. But I also just think that the entire rest of the world is just trying to do things that they're good at. One of the things I really value about the EA community is people are actively trying to make decisions on trying to help the world as much as they can. So that's one thing that I feel a little bit more concerned about in this kind of framing. And then also there's this other piece that sort of, picking between different things based on personal fit can be really useful for some people, but I just think it's not that decisive for other people. So for some people, they have what you might call a spiky skill set. There's some things that they're really good at, and they're just obviously way more excited and way better at that thing than they are at other things. But then, for those people, I think this kind of advice is just tailor-made, and I can understand why the aptitude framework really resonates with them. But I think there are other people who have a more rounded skill set, who can sort of see themselves doing a bunch of different things, don't tend to see their motivation like massively change between different types of activity. Maybe it's just like more dominated by, you know, the type of organization and the colleagues that they're working with. And it's not really to do with the aptitude, their like sort of motivation and working hard. And so I think for those kinds of people, this message of, you know, pick the longer term path based really strongly on personal fit is actually just not going to give them that much useful information. And so it would do better to sort of focus a bit more on some of the other, like, you know, what's the expected value of this path in general. I think I would put myself in this category, and often when I talk to people with like similar-ish backgrounds who've done kind of consulting and who've like done stuff that like, you know, you were working for the man and like doing something that wasn't that aligned with your motivations, but worked really hard at it anyway. I think people in that kind of situation often end up feeling a bit like this. That's my guess. So that's the, sorry, I'm over back. That's the sort of my thoughts on how to pick between different options. I think for a lot of people, like a lot of people could stand to hear a bit more, you know, pay attention to personal fit. It's really important. But for a lot of people, I think maybe this is not quite the most useful or most helpful advice. Okay, and then the last bit, this sort of part 3, what should your career strategy be along the way? And the aptitude framework says, once you pick your aptitude, go get great at that aptitude. And this is the bit that I think I like the most about it. I think it's really, as Holden says, it's action guiding. You know, it's often quite hard to know what specific thing you should be doing to try and get yourself in a position for a role many decades down the line. But it is a lot easier for you to tell, like, how can I get good at this specific skill? You know, there's like colleagues and an organization around you that are probably going to be helping you and like do that kind of thing. It also can be just like particularly motivating as like professional development goals. So I think it's great on that respect. And then also, as a community, I think it's really good for us to be valuing people doing this skill building. We really need people who are very good at things, and it takes a while to build up that skills. I do think that, you know, not all of the most important roles for having an impact are sort of within EA organizations, and certainly the places that are best to learn skills are not always in EA organizations. And we need people to go and like get really good at stuff and bring those skills to bear on like impactful issues. And so the extent to which, you know, this aptitude framework gives like community support and validation for going and doing that skill building, I think that's a great thing. I think my quibbles here are more a little bit about framing. So in the original post, Holden talks a bit about aiming to become world class. Now I think people vary on this. Like some people find this framing of like go be world class at something to be really inspirational and a great ambitious goal, and that's great. But for some people, I think this is just really off-putting. And I think, you know, a lot of people suffer from imposter syndrome, and I really don't want to put people off with this like emphasis on being world-class. I think that you can still have ambitious goals that are maybe framed in like slightly different ways. Like personally, I think I would find an ambitious goal framed in terms of like aim to get to work at this place or in this kind of role to be a bit more like similarly ambitious, but not quite as off-putting. So I would say that this is not a crucial part of the framework, though. I think the general message is not like you have to become world class. It's more like go get better at it than you are right now. Go get as good as you can personally get at the thing, and in which case that seems good. And then lastly, I think I just do want to float that you know, different career strategies are important at different points in your career. So at ATK, we sort of have this like 3-part framework of the different kinds of career stages that you might find yourself at. So, you know, early on, you might want to focus on exploration to just test out a few different things and work out what you're good at. And then you might want to get to this stage where you, invest pretty hard in your skill sets and like aim for a particular thing. And then at some point, you want to cash it in, deploy those skills, do a bunch of good, like start working on direct impact. And so roughly you might think of these as like things that you do chronologically at different stages, but they will always be a bit of a mix of these different priorities at any point. And so you might want to stay alert to opportunities, keep your eyes out for opportunities to sort of deploy your skills like maybe earlier than you might think. You also might want to make sure that you do a bunch of exploration before you specifically focus on one particular aptitude and don't neglect that as well. The sort of go get great at the thing is very much focused on this kind of invest stage, which is roughly what most people should be doing kind of early career, which is what Holden's aptitude framework is particularly aimed at. So I think it's great, but I just want to point out that you don't definitely want to not neglect exploring early on. Don't like double down too quickly on a particular thing that just happens to be the one thing that you've done at university that you liked. Definitely explore a bit, then go get great at it, and then do make sure that you look out for opportunities to use those skills maybe earlier than you might think. And I do often sort of talk to people who are have experience in the wide world and sort of often try and tell them how useful the skills are that they've already built up and how they can start using them sooner than they might think. Okay, so those are the 3 parts. Where does that leave us overall? Well, what to focus on? I think aptitudes are a pretty useful thing, but I think sometimes we also want to not lose focus on sometimes the specific path is a useful thing to focus on. And I'm particularly keen to not lose as much kind of community focus on cause choice being an important part of career planning. And then how to pick between different things. This is just really hard to give general advice to everyone on, right? I think for some people, you really want to pay more attention to personal fit than you are already. And some people, maybe you want to de-emphasize that a little bit. And you've got to work out what is right for you. But my biggest concern is perhaps this focus on the sense to which focusing on personal fit is emphasizing this focus on your motivation or your interest and whether that might lead away from impact. And then lastly, what career strategy? Yeah, I kind of particularly like this sort of explore, invest, do good, or deploy kind of framework that we have. So I guess closing thought is something it's pretty hard to get a framework that covers absolutely everything and works for absolutely everyone. I think one of the things that Holden talks about is that it just seems useful to try on different frameworks for size and see what works for you. So I think if you haven't already checked these things out, I definitely recommend people checking out 80,000 Hours, web resources on career planning, and also checking out Holden's aptitudes framework post and seeing what seems like it might be useful for you and what kind of seem like good takeaways. Cool. Thank you very much. And I'm just gonna sit down and Arden's gonna come back on stage and we're gonna do a Q&A now.
All right, thanks a lot, Habiba. So yeah, let's jump into questions. Please submit. Some people have already started, and let's get started. So you mentioned that people with these sort of spiky skill profiles might be especially well suited to following this aptitudes framework. Is there anything else we can say about who the aptitudes framework might be most useful for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's aimed at early career, and then the specific type of profile or something. I think the spiky skill set seems pretty good. Maybe there's something someone was talking to me a bit about was maybe there are some of the big 5 personality traits that might track to some of these things. So maybe people who are particularly high on conscientiousness are particularly good at just working in large organizations where not all the work is super fun, but you work really hard at it anyway. And so maybe that they might want to focus particularly more on the sort of cause focused stuff rather than the aptitude framework. But these are just some speculative guesses at the moment.
Yeah, I had this thought that does it vary by cause area that people are convinced are most pressing? So if some cause areas there's a little bit more certainty about which roles might be highest impact than others, in which case it might make more sense to focus on the role framework for those?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, for example, if you're a long-termist and you think that AI is a really big deal, becoming a technical AI safety researcher is probably one of the best things that we can think of. That actually seems we definitely want a sizable proportion of people doing that. And so if that is your view, then this sort of path-focused might be particularly valuable there. I also do think that with some of the near-term focused things, it's maybe just a bit clearer about what seem valuable positions to go for. If you're interested in animal welfare or global poverty, there's an ecosystem there. There are existing roles out there that you could maybe aim for. So, but I know less about those.
Cool. So, question from the audience: how good are our guesses about which aptitudes will or won't be valuable in, say, 10 years? And then maybe compare and contrast that with our guesses about roles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. I think it is easier to make a guess on generalist aptitudes or skill sets, broad clusters of skill sets, because you just don't have to narrow things down too far. Yeah. So I think it's probably it's maybe a bit easier to do best guesses. But I don't know. I'm not sure. It's a good question. Maybe it's actually just as hard to make guesses on what kinds of aptitudes are going to really cash out as it is about specific roles. But there's something about you've got to predict kind of what kinds of organizations are going to be, what kind of demand is there going to be, what specific working practices are going to mean that specific roles are more or less in demand. So I do think it is a bit harder to do the path focused predictions. I feel I've What was the specific question again?
I guess it was how good are our guesses in each case. I think you said they're better in the case of aptitudes, you think?
Yeah, I think that was my answer. Thank you, I didn't know. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because this question came in early, so I was looking at it, and I think, could it be just that like some aptitudes seem like, or like sets of skills seem like they've been useful for a really long time, so like people management, organization building, that kind of thing. Maybe just like general sort of like entrepreneurialism, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I guess it like does feel like there are some that we know are like pretty useful, whereas maybe roles are more often in flux, change more over time.
That sounds right.
And just fewer aptitudes, I think. Like, you know, if you tried to list them all, there'd be fewer than the number of roles. So, you know, you might expect them to.
Yeah. But I think there's like I guess there's a risk that you miss some really like niche skill sets that are just going to be really important. If everyone's going and getting like, I'm just generally good at like running a team and like managing people, but then it turns out you actually just really needed a lot of like specific expertise in synthetic biology or something. And like, yeah, it's quite hard to make those predictions that far out, which is kind of why I'm also excited about people doing, you know, exploration and like cause X and things like that as well. And in some ways people need to kind of like commit to these like slightly more niche things in order to get better guesses about what the future might hold.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, you know, not very long ago, people started talking a bit about how like, oh, we really wish there were more EA historians. And it seems like that's the kind of thing like that was sort of like history research, like feels like a bit distinct from other aptitudes that people might be building. And that was like a bit hard to predict. So it's obviously not like, you always know what's going to be useful in the future, even on the aptitudes side of things.
Turns out predicting the future is hard.
Great. That's the take-home message. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So, in terms of like exploring different aptitudes, do you have any just thoughts, advice for how people can explore different aptitudes, and how might that differ from advice on exploring different career paths?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I guess I'm thinking in my head about someone who's like doing their undergrad and is thinking, or maybe in the first couple of years of work, and they're thinking about what to do. So like when you're at undergrad, it's a great time to do a bit of like something like research, something like internships at different companies or organizations, and also do things that are sort of student run, like running, volunteering or like community building or something like that, which gives you a chance to do sort of leadership type things. So I think a lot of the sort of standard things that you might try give you a chance to try out a few different types of aptitudes. Yeah, for some of the specific roles, I think that is just going to depend on which ones are in your shortlist. And then there's just more specific advice for some of those specific roles and like what that might look like. Yeah, maybe my general advice is something like, yeah, while you're studying is a particularly good time to do a lot of this stuff because you have like chance to do internships and things like that in your summer holidays or other holidays, and you have like a bunch of flexibility around your time. It starts getting harder and harder, I think, to make time to do this kind of thing when you're like when you're working. But you can try and, you know, see if you can shape your role a little bit more to sort of, yeah, to take on different responsibilities or things like that.
Yeah, I wonder if like, so here's an instinct I have, I don't know if it's right, that like, it's easier to test out aptitudes in like bite-sized chunks or something. Like if you're at you have some role and you say like, hey, can I take on that one project, or can I like I want to move toward like trying to manage people or something, like without even changing job. Whereas maybe it would be a little bit, or like maybe you're a student and you take a class and like, you know, do something technical and you're like, oh, do I have an aptitude for this kind of technical work? Maybe you can test that out before you can test out roles.
Yeah, although on the flip side, I do think that insofar as some paths or roles requires like knowledge and like an interest in engaging with a particular topic, that actually seems like some of the lowest cost things to test. I think it's like easier to like try reading some papers and see if this is like interesting to you than it is to actually like take on a whole project and like trying to do things. And so that makes that a little easier. It's a little easier to test kind of like different sort of subject matter domains or something. Yeah. I think one thing I'm a little nervous about in terms of people trying out aptitudes is this like, not exploring enough, because I think it's very easy to misattribute how much you're enjoying something or how good you are at it to like a whole host of other things that are going on in terms of like how the rest of your life is going and like what your particular boss is like. And so I really don't want people to sort of like have tried out doing like one time tried running an event and be like, that was terrible, never gonna do that again. I think committing to something for a bit longer or like trying it out in different situations is actually really useful. So I guess like the earlier you can start exploring, the better.
Yeah, that's a good point. So maybe the thing that I said could even be like a misconception that needs to be battled a bit, or like where you can, oh yeah, I can see if I have this event running aptitude, or this sort of maybe OPSI aptitude just by trying this out one time. Whereas with roles, it's sort of more obvious that you need to like, you really have to go do it. Like you never expect to be like, well, I explored this role because I spent one day doing something.
Yeah. Maybe it gives you like a false sense of confidence that you can have tried an aptitude very quickly, when I'm not sure that you can. I think like I did consulting for 4 years. I really struggled in the first few years of being like, am I good at this? Like I'm not really sure what's going on here. And it took a while for me to like, it's just quite different from like studying at university where you get like marks and objective feedback about whether you're doing the right thing or not. And it took me a while to get used to like, okay, yeah, no, this is like, I am good at this in these ways, and get on really good projects and stuff. I think it would have been incorrect for me to have like concluded pretty early that like, oh, I'm not really good at this OPSI thing.
All right, this question, it seems like the kind of thing that one would want to do one's homework about first, so you feel free to pass. But somebody asked whether you can recommend any resources for rapid aptitude development or methods that we can use to develop aptitudes really effectively. So I guess this is things like courses, readings, videos, any other thing like that come to mind?
Yeah, nothing particularly that seems like really good. I think we do have a really nice article on like how to find your strengths on the 80,000 Hours website, which is particularly like has a bunch of different exercises that you can do for like getting a sense of like which things energize you and that kind of thing. So I guess that's like a good first starting point for identification. But then for like actual development of a specific aptitude, I mean, Holden's post has like a few lines on each one about like things that you can be doing, which at least like, sets you off in hopefully the right direction. But I imagine there's just like more specific resources out there that I can't think of off the top of my head right now.
Yeah, I'm sure it's also like some probably take a lot more investment to build than others. Like I'm thinking this sort of management type thing. It's like, well, you can't. I think that's the kind of thing you need like a bunch of time to like try out and whereas maybe things like things that are more technical or more just like very like specific skill based, you might be able to develop more quickly.
Yeah, I do think management is an interesting one because I think you could at university get a chance to like run a team, whereas then when you enter the working world, it might take you a bit longer to get to a level of seniority where you can manage people. Although managing a team of volunteers is like much harder than managing employees who are paid to be there. So that's one thing. But I think there are aptitudes like these political and bureaucratic aptitudes, which is it's just going to be really hard to work out whether you're good at navigating the DC policy world until you're kind of there. But so you can do some sort of like summer in DC programs or like, but you need to probably get some experience in the world first before you can conclude things.
Cool. So based on your experience in advising, do you have a sense of which aptitudes are particularly in demand right now in effective altruism or elsewhere?
I mean, I slightly would defer to Ben Todd's talk yesterday about the state of EA, but I think that this kind of, the people who are could really handle like running like a mega project, something that has the budget of like bigger than 80,000 hours or something, can run something really ambitious. That's like a relatively rare skill set for people to have in the EA community already. And this is the kind of thing that you just need to have gone out in the real world and had like a bunch of experience like running big things for that. So that seems great. Yeah, I think skills in kind of navigating, political bureaucracies, particularly somewhere like the US government, seems particularly, in demand. It's like a bit of plays to slightly different skill sets than might be like common elsewhere in EA. I think particularly like for navigating like running for office or something like that seems like a thing that I'm excited for more people to consider. Other things, I guess like grant makers is the other thing that's on like Ben's post. Do you think there's anything else?
I guess this is kind of a version, or like a broader version of the first thing, but entrepreneurship and sort of like the ability to like build products and teams and run things sort of pretty independently. I think is something that it seems like is like very much in the water as something we wish we had more of.
Yeah, and then there's other things where sort of it seems like a bunch of people have this aptitude, but like don't realize how in demand it is. So for example, a lot of the AI safety companies that are starting or scaling up right now really need like good programmers and ML engineers. And this is actually like, we have a bunch of programmers in the EA community, but maybe people don't realize how much that particular aptitude actually is in demand right now.
Yeah, and I do think that feels more recent to me. Maybe, I'm not actually exactly sure how that happened, if like the work changed and like it was more people were needed for this, or if it was like something about like, people started switching out of like software engineering into other things, and now we need more software engineers.
Yeah, I'm not really sure either. I think my guess is that there's been a bunch of interest in starting up a bunch of new things, and so then a few new things have started, and when they're new, they need to like hire a bunch more people in, and there's like ambition more about scaling. But I think there's also a little bit of like interest in creating opportunities that a lot of people can get involved in, given this like recognition of the fact that this is like a skill set that is out there.
All right, cool. This is a somewhat different topic. So someone asks, as the EA movement gets bigger, will a greater proportion of EAs need to follow the aptitude framework, as cause-specific roles are somewhat limited and should eventually get filled by talented EAs?
What an interesting question. Okay. I'm not sure I've thought about this long enough to have an informed answer. Yeah, how do I think that things might go in the future? I mean, I sort of expect the median age of EA to be like creeping up ever so slightly. And so I slightly expect that we'll have more and more people who have like been developing aptitudes who are like switching more into this like deploy or do good stage. Like, I sort of feel like I'm an example of someone who's on like the crest of that. Like, I went off and did consulting, like in part because of 80,000 hours advice and like flexible career capital back in the day, and then have switched over the last few years into sort of working for meta organizations. So in some ways, I feel a little bit like the aptitude emphasis is going to be a little less pressing for the community, because like naturally people will hopefully have done a bunch of this skill building already, and so we'll have a bigger pool of people with like a broad range of skill sets. Yeah, I don't see, I kind of feel like our predictions on like roles that seem worth having is just like, I don't see what, like, I feel like that's just we're always going to be like looking ahead and like making new predictions about what's going to be like new roles that are going to be valuable in the future.
Yeah, I actually have an instinct that I think this is in the same direction as what you said, that it will go the other way. So I think at least, okay, I guess in a good case, right? Like, it could go off the rails, but in a good case, people would, as people explore more areas and people try things out, they see if it works, they see if it doesn't, as people do more career research, there'll be more of a sense of which roles are higher impact. And so then we should expect there to be an expanding set of roles as opposed to a shrinking one. Although, I mean, it depends on how fast the EA community grows as well. So I'm not sure. And
it also, I think, depends on like whether we like discover some whole new area that we like just have been massively under-investing in, and suddenly there are like a bunch of new things that we need people to like train up in or something like that. So that could just like shift things pretty drastically.
I guess also how successful the sort of push for entrepreneurship and mega projects is, right? If that's really successful, then that should open up a lot more roles. But yeah, so I guess it seems to depend on a lot of things. Maybe it's like, it feels like in order for a lot more roles to open up, like a bunch of stuff needs to happen, whereas like we know that like we can always be building aptitudes, so there's something a bit more robust feeling about it. And I feel like, I'm not sure, I don't want to misattribute, but I feel like that's part of what's behind the question a bit. It's like, well, like I don't know what's going on with that role stuff, but like this, like we can all do this, or something like that. Does that sound right to you?
I think I do find that appeal of the aptitude framework. And again, I think when you take the sort of portfolio approach, looking at across the EA community, what do we want different people to be doing? It just seems kind of good for some people to be having these like slightly more hedged kind of generalist aptitudes. We're going to be able to rely on these people to be able to like run organizations in the future. But I think we also do want like some of this emphasis on the the role stuff as well. And it's hard to tell how that balance is gonna go in the future though. I think it's also hard to tell what I think the correct balance is right now, to be clear.
Yeah. I also feel like, so this says like cause-specific roles, and I feel like that's like a slightly confused, so it's like if you're something like a fundraiser or a people manager or something like that, it's like you might be doing that while really focused on a particular cause, working in an organization that is focused on that cause. And so in that sense, you're not really, you're kind of working with the cause framework, because maybe you like chose that cause and then you decided like, now I know what it needs. The bottleneck is like people to build things, so I'm going to go do that. And yet it's not sort of like the kind of role that doesn't appear in other cause areas. So in that sense, it's not cause specific. Yeah, maybe those kinds of things. That's like part of where these two frameworks start to blur together. Anyway.
Yeah, a little. I think there are also some like very I think that people who have this kind of like aptitude and like this very generalist skill set have the luxury of choice in that they just can work on like lots of different things often. And like I'm in that bucket in that like I just haven't had to particularly like come down hard on one particular like area. And it does mean that you are more able to sort of be like a bit neutral about where you might go in the future. But the knowledge is really valuable when you are working on a core specific area, but it is,
Yeah, thanks for rescuing my terrible question. I appreciate that. Okay, somebody asks, very simple, how can you tell if you're kicking ass at something?
So again, I would defer to Holden's post. He like has some like, so one of the things that's really good about it is like focus on trying to be action guiding. He's like, this is the aptitude, this is what it looks like, this is the kind of the way that you can tell if you're on track. I guess some like general things are, are you getting good feedback from colleagues or people around you? Do you seem to be, like developing a reputation, I think is like particularly good. So one of the things I didn't go into in tons of detail is that one of the reasons Holden gives for why being really successful is actually very valuable is because it's not like, say for example, the difference between like a good programmer and a great programmer. The person who's a great programmer, they're better at doing the programming, but then they're also like well known for being like a great programmer. And so other people will be like, hey, have you heard of X? They're like really good. And like then further opportunities will be like opened up. So like maybe you might be able to tell if that kind of thing is happening to you a little bit. Like do you tend to get, people like often pass you on to other folks or sort of recommend you for stuff?
I guess speaking of that, another good thing about just being really exceptional at your job is like you can like become sort of somebody who is helpful for creating the network, because you can be like, oh, I can tell that this person has that thing that will be helpful with this other person. I mean, maybe that's a separate skill, but it feels like it would go along with just being like really kick-ass at something.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like a positive externality or something for the community as a whole.
Yeah, I do actually think it is relatively easy to tell how good you are at your job. I think like there just tend to be in organizations like a ton of like feedback mechanisms and performance management mechanisms and things. And you should have a manager who hopefully is able to give you feedback and like colleagues and things like that. Maybe it's a bit harder if you're working by yourself. But yeah, this is one of the good points is like it tends to be relatively easy to tell, I think, if you are doing good at the thing, if you're good at the thing that you're doing.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, you sort of caveated this in the way that I want to, but a bit more, which I think like if you're working at a well-run organization, then it's like like easy to tell if you're doing well.
Yeah, that's true.
Because you get lots of feedback and so on. But I think a lot of, I don't know. My sense is that a lot of organizations and things like academia, which are like pretty light on the management, it might be a lot harder to tell.
That's a good caveat.
In which case, I guess you have to just like seek it out or try to like test it for yourself or like ask people and be like, no, really, tell me.
Yeah, that seems good. Yeah, and that kind of in the article that I mentioned about how to work out your strengths. Yeah, one of the things that we suggest is like ask for feedback from a bunch of people who know your work well to try and get triangulate different results about what you might be good at.
All right. So, okay, here's another question, another slight pivot. Is it possible that getting impressive roles is even more important than getting roles that build aptitudes? So maybe coming across as impressive is the best way to become influential, this person suggests?
I think that's a really interesting question. So we have another 80,000 hours thing that we have is this like anonymous advice series, and some people have quite different instincts on this. Like some people really emphasize getting really good at the thing. Some people really emphasize the like making sure people know you and know that you're really good at the thing. Some people specifically kind of like, would de-emphasize the like making your CV like look cool and more emphasize the like making sure you've got really robust skills. But I think this is quite dependent on the field, and like sometimes having name brand companies, having like be able to talk about like a really like high prestige position that you've been in sounds really good. There's a person who shall remain nameless who was on a path to becoming like do economics research, and they turned down an opportunity to be in the Obama administration because it wasn't really like on their track for like becoming a really good economics researcher. And maybe this is the kind of time where it's like, maybe even if it wasn't the particular aptitude that they were trying to build or something, that would have been sufficiently impressive that it was actually worthwhile taking as a career step.
Worth a bit of opportunism there. Yeah, that's interesting. I would guess that it's also more important in fields where there are larger numbers of people and people have to depend more on like generic impressiveness signals. Do you know what I mean? So like if you're like working in like AI technical safety, it's like a small world. Like maybe, you know, you can show people your work more easily, or like more people know one another, whereas if you're in policy or politics, it's like, well, there's like established mechanisms of like showing people that you're good at stuff, and you better do those mechanisms or else like nobody's going to listen to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there are certain, I can imagine that you could do just as good work at like smaller firms or something with less name recognition. You could be doing just as like really interesting and valuable like day-to-day work as in like a really famous, well-known company. But when people are, you know, looking at your CV or something, like maybe they might pay more, like be more, pay you more attention if they sort of like recognize one of the names. This is just really dependent on different fields, and like in some fields it's just like not that big a deal, but in some fields it might be more of a bigger deal.
Okay, so going back to this sort of like comparison between the different frameworks, it seems like the path-focused framework is going to be more important if there are sometimes paths that are way more high impact than others, but use the same skills and are in the same cause area, right? So like where the sort of, or by skills, of course, I mean this sort of cluster of skills and knowledge that aptitudes is supposed to refer to, such that the aptitude framework might not lead you to one over the other. How often do you think that's the case in the real world?
Yeah, so maybe as an example here, something like you could have like an organization running aptitude, but maybe it's like more valuable to use that starting up a new project than just going to work at like some like massive organization or something. Is that the kind of thing that we're pointing at?
Yeah, so like I'm imagining, all right, let's say you already think the cause area you think is most pressing is biorisk. And you're doing research, and like that's the aptitude, and sort of maybe like, yeah, there's like really in-depth research, but like one path is like doing that and trying to like show it to policymakers or something, and the other is like doing it in academia, and maybe one of those is much more high impact than the other. In which case, if that was the case, then maybe the path framework would be more important to pay attention to there.
Yeah, that does seem plausible in a bunch of different cases. I think like research is just like, yeah, I do think that like having an aptitude for like academic style research is just like clustering a ton of stuff into there, and there is a lot more differentiation. And one of those ways of differentiating this might be like the particular thing that you're aiming to do with your research, and like who your audience is. Whether you're aiming to, is your theory of change here that you're trying to do really excellent research and get like other academics interested in what you're doing and like build the field? Or is it that you're just like trying to do like really rigorous academic style research, but like get to the right answers and like you don't really care about publishing that in a great journal, you just want to like get the ideas out there? Or is it that you want to like actually interface a bunch with like policymakers, and so you want to have pretty close connections? Like all of these, like might be different flavors of, I mean some of them use slightly different skills, but they are slightly different focused paths. So I think that, I'm not sure about how common this is overall, but it definitely does seem like, at least the example that you point to around academic research, it does feel like there are going to be like different subpaths here, and like maybe this relates to kind of what your theory of impact might be.
All right, cool. I'm gonna take a moment to read the new questions here.
Yeah, and if you do have favorites of the questions, then you can like upvote them to help Arden's job out here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will try and think of other paths where I think, other like aptitudes where I think there might be like differentiations between paths. I do think that's a really good question. I don't think I've thought about this enough. The organization building was like another one that came to mind. I guess like if you're going for like government, then governments are huge. There are tons of different like departments or roles that might be doing more or less useful things that all kind of like are in the same cluster of aptitudes. I guess I'm like defaulting to the aptitudes that feel very, paths and aptitude clothing. Maybe it's less relevant for the aptitudes that feel like aptitudes.
All right, thank you for that time. All right, would you have any aptitude building advice specific for students in middle to low income countries who might feel off-put by the pressure capability to be able to achieve larger impact when they come from a low to middle income country?
Yeah, I feel like I don't feel like I'm an expert in this area at all. I think, there are probably people out there who have much better thoughts on this. But in general, maybe this is the kind of thing where yeah, maybe my instinct is that like this is actually where like credentials or something might go further than like aptitudes, because maybe you want to be doing the thing that you can to get like, you know, recognizable organizations, or like can you do something with like maybe like with national government or with like international organizations or something, or multilateral corporations, like things that then might have a lot of cachet. So that's like one thought there. But if you're specifically focusing on developing aptitudes, I think I probably don't have any like generalizable advice to all low and middle income countries. Probably you know the opportunities in your area better than I do.
Yeah, I could imagine that like some resources for building aptitudes are more location specific, and more often expensive, like university educations, and things that you can do there. Whereas like presumably there's a lot of like other resources that are more freely available. So I guess that's one place to start, but I agree, this is a hard question that
I mean, if you have better answers, put it in the chat and help that person out better than I can.
Nice. Okay, so one thing you mentioned during the talk was that the aptitude framework felt really motivating, and one reason is that it sort of encourages validation and support for people who are building aptitudes in the EA community. And yeah, I'm just curious if you have any more thoughts on ways that we can like enhance that validation and support for people who are trying to figure out what they're good at, what they can excel at, and how they can eventually use it.
Yeah, there was a really interesting thing recently on the forum where like people were encouraged to write about their jobs, which I think was really nice. And
yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, it's one of the things that you were talking about with this kind of the externality of like, if you're good at the thing, you can like help others and give them advice. And I think the sort of like positive reinforcement around people feeling like they can sort of still be very connected and valued in the EA community for the knowledge that they've got in their particular area sounds really good. I think that a lot of the professional networks around particular like disciplines seems great. Like I really like the EA finance group, and there's like an EA medicine or like healthcare kind of professionals group as well. EA consultants. These might be like communities where it's you're like kind of connecting with like-minded people, feeling like like there's like events and like newsletters and sort of things that are tailored towards what you're doing, and that can help you feel like you're on, you know, connected with value and like on the right path.
Yeah, I also feel like I feel like the language of aptitudes is really helpful here, because you can be like, what are you up to? And you'll be like, well, I'm working on becoming like a great organization builder or something like that. And instead of like, well, I'm exploring or I'm building career capital, which sounds a little bit generic. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just because it's new and shiny, and so then I'm like, ooh, like that sounds good.
Aptitudes is the new hot thing on the block.
Yeah. Okay. Are you building any aptitudes right now?
Yeah, so I do think that I'm probably like putting relatively more emphasis on the third stage of the kind of career priorities at the moment.
The sort of like, that is?
Yes, so this is the like deploying your skills or doing good. Like I think I'm still, you know, probably not at the sort of, you know, I've got plenty of career left ahead of me, hopefully. But I think we're both in situations where we've found, hopefully, like particularly good opportunities to use the skills that we've already built up already. But at the same time, I think I'm definitely improving, hopefully, at a bunch of different things. I would say that like right now, I'm much more interested in building my own like knowledge of particular cause areas and like the nuances of arguments in different things. Like have particularly been focusing on like, you know, different arguments for whether to focus on long-termism or existential risk and like broad long-termism, and like getting a better understanding of like AI timelines and like different causes of risk there, which I don't know whether that counts necessarily as an aptitude. Like I am more interested in the knowledge specific stuff right now. I just feel like there's so much more that I want to learn. There's a little bit of aptitude building on the side, but I think that's not my primary focus, which I think makes me a little bit unusual in both maybe 8,000 hours or like many people in like different organizations that like I think it is pretty natural to be focusing on like building particular aptitudes in the job that you're in, because you want to get good at the job that you're doing. I just feel like my job, and also what I'm hoping to do later on in my career, is actually just like the thing that I want to get better at is like knowing a bunch more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually surprised to hear you say that that's not part of building the aptitude. I mean, it's not on the list because it's very specific.
Yeah.
But I feel like giving amazing career advice is like something that requires a bunch of knowledge, and if you like you can get a lot better at that by learning more.
Yes, I guess so. So it's definitely like a little bit part of it. So this is one thing I didn't kind of talk about that much, but it is possible that everyone might be wanting to sort of be building knowledge and like networks and connections that also aren't like so specifically for your particular job, but are also just like more about like staying up to date with stuff that's happening in EA and like the arguments that people are having on the forum and the latest thinking there. And like for me, I think there's like some chance that is actually part of the aptitude of the thing that I'm doing because my job is in like meta work. But I think even if other people, their job is not specifically in meta, I think it also might make them still better at like their impact for the course of their career if they're also focusing on this kind of like knowledge and like, I don't know if it's an aptitude, but like aptitude for like seeking impact or something. Yeah, there's a bit of a messy answer, but yes, I guess the thought is something like, for my specific job, okay, like knowing about a bunch of stuff is actually a pretty useful thing to do, but I think it's also just like useful for non-ATK careers advisors.
All right, well, we have 17 seconds left, so I think it's time for us to wrap up. Thanks so much, Habiba.